A crucial part of any practice is making sure you can receive payment from your patients. This is only possible if you can pull accurate amounts due. MOGO lets you access these accurate amounts on the Accounts Receivable report. You have two reports to choose from, whether you want to view the balances by individuals or by families. Before we look at the report itself, we need to address a common misconception some offices make: that the accounts receivable will match other reports. The reason that the report does not match is because the accounts receivable is what I refer to as a lifetime report. This means that the report's totals have been calculating since you installed the program initially. This differs from the other reports because they always ask you for a date range to generate the report. Now, let's click on the desired report and click the Generate button. Depending on the number of patients you have in your database, the report can take some time to generate. After generating the report, MOGO will ask you if you want to go to the statement printing screen. Click Yes, and you will be brought to the Accounts Receivable report. Before we go into the names and balances on the report, we're going to break down the screen to its individual parts. Our first section is the toolbar. The first button is the free try link, which will give you information about sending statements electronically through MOGO provided by Change Healthcare, formerly known as MDON. The three stacked check marks will either select all or deselect all. The next icon will invert your selection. This will access the statement settings. You can choose to include tooth numbers and surfaces, insurance information, insurance claim codes, decide which address to show as the return address, how far back transactions will show on the statement, and finally, how many to print in each batch. Those last two need a little bit of explanation. However many days you decide will show on the statement. Anything prior to that date will show as previous balance. Sometimes, printers have a hard time dealing with a lot of jobs if sent to their queue all at once. For that reason, we have included the batch setting. You can choose how many jobs get sent in each batch to make sure the printer can handle the printing without errors. Clicking on the OK hand will bring you back to the report. The next 5 icons all have to do with individual patients highlighted on the report. You can launch the phone book, patient info screen, transaction screen, appointment book, and appointment history. You can click on this icon to see a preview of what the statement will look like for the patient you have highlighted on the report. The printer will print the statements for the highlighted patient or patients, and the email icon will send the statement as an email. This option requires you have an email address set up in the digital communication suite. Next, let's take a look at the menus and their options. The only option under File is to exit the report. Under Patient, you can access patient-specific information for the patient you have highlighted on the report. You can access the appointment history under the Appointment menu. The Print menu has a whole host of available options. You can print the patient statement, either to the printer or via email. You can print past due billing letters. You can access your quick letters to print for the patients. Both labels and envelopes can be printed. If you would like to have a printed copy of the entire accounts receivable report, you can print it via the Merge Report option. Smart Print will attempt to print the entire report on one page, which can cause the font to be very small. Again, this depends on the number of patient records you have in your database. The Use Screen Font option will print the report in the same size as the displayed report, so it will likely print on more than one page, but it will be easier to read than when printing via the Smart Print option. If you have created treatment plans in the transaction screen for your patients, you can print them from here. Finally, you can print labels, envelopes, and quick letters for patient referrals. Your Setup menu has a few options for you to choose between. We will get back to billing options in just a minute, but first we will look at the display settings below. Statement options is the same settings as clicking on the setup icon on the toolbar. You can choose the font size, reset column width to the defaults, and enable multi-selecting with mouse clicks. This way, you can select additional patients by just clicking on each one. You can decide what order the patients will display on the printout. Printer setup lets you change the default printer settings. Billing service setup is where you would put your login information if you sign up for electronic statements. Now, let's go back up to the billing setup and take a look at that screen. The first thing to do is select which provider you would like to adjust the billing setup for. Each provider can have different setup, so you will need to adjust this for each provider. What we're looking at on the top is what we consider our aging periods. You can put any number of days in these fields to adjust what your aging periods are. If you would like to include past due messages on the statements for each period, you can set those up using these options. You can set up different messages for each aging period and for both patients with and patients without insurance coverage. You can also set up past due letters in the MOGO word processor. If you do, you can link them to each period in this section. Next, we must determine at what threshold we print the statements for our patients. Minimum billing amount goes hand in hand with before or after insurance pending. Before insurance pending looks at the total balance and is not concerned with the amount in insurance pending. As long as the total amount the patient owes is greater than the minimum amount, their statement will print. After insurance pending looks at the amount in patient balance, not the total amount. With this option checked off, the amount that the patient owes after insurance has been estimated must be over the threshold in order for their statement to print. For example, our minimum billing amount is $5. Our patient has treatment totaling $150, $147 of which is estimated insurance. With the before insurance pending option checked off, the patient's statement will print since their total amount is over $5. If the after insurance pending option was checked off, their statement will not print due to their patient balance being under $5. Regardless of which option you choose, you can opt to have any treatment with pending insurance not show on the printed statement by checking off this box. Do you charge a late fee? How about interest? If so, when do you start charging? You can enter the amount of your late charge as well as the period that the program will apply either the late charge or interest in these fields. When do we want to start sending statements? We can choose between the aging periods to say when do we start printing out the statements. In a few minutes, we will see what the process is like for printing the statements. One of the steps we will see is that after we print the statement, MOGO will ask if we want to automatically forward the next statement date. What this means is, when do we want to print the statement again? By forwarding the next statement date, you can select all patients and print statements, but it will not print for any patient whose next statement date is in the future. You can choose the automatic forward length here. We also need to choose when we tell the patient their payment is due. This next field wants to know if there is a minimum threshold for charging interest, meaning if the patient owes less than a certain amount, no interest will be applied. These three messages will be added to the bottom of the statement, thanking the patient for making a payment, their insurance making a payment, or both the patient and insurance making a payment. Finally, as mentioned before, if you have an email address set up in the digital communication suite, you can send your statements via email. If you wish to do so, you need to have an email address selected here. If you're unsure if you have one set up, simply click on the drop-down menu. If no email account is listed, you have none set up in the DCS. Moving on to the Tools menu, we have a few choices. Phone Book launches the highlighted patient's contact information. You can manually apply interest by selecting the patient and choosing this option. As we mentioned earlier, if a patient's next statement date is in the future, the statement will not print. You can recover or reset the date by clicking this option. We went over printing the accounts receivable report under the Print menu, but if you would rather export the report into a format that can be opened by spreadsheet programs such as Microsoft Excel, you can do so by choosing the Export Data option. Finally, you can select all, deselect all, or invert your selection under the Select menu. Okay, so now that we have looked over everything but the actual report, let's look at the report. We're going to go over the columns that are unique to the accounts receivable report. Family head name and family head ID are self-explanatory. Family total is the total of the next two columns, insurance balance and family balance. Depending on what we chose in the billing setup, the billable column may or may not match the family total. Whether it does or not, the amount in this column is what will show on the patient's statement as being billable. The account type field sets up interest, represented by an I equals something, separate statements, represented by an S, and different languages, represented by an L. If there is I equals and a number, the program can charge that patient interest. If there is an S, the patient will be on a separate statement from their family. And if there is an L, the patient's statement will print in Spanish. LVD stands for last visit date. FHPROV displays the family head provider's initials. Current 0, first 1, second 2, third 3, and fourth 4 breaks down the billable amount into the aging periods as we set them up in billing setup. Next statement is the next day you can print the statement for the patient. As we mentioned before, if the date is in the future, the statement will not print for the patient even if they are highlighted. If you have charged the patient interest, it will show in the interest column. The flag column will show different codes for different situations for the patient. For example, if I print labels for Jamie, his line on the report will be turned blue, and there will be LA in the flag column. If I print an envelope for Kelly, her line will be red, and there will be an EN in her flag column. The date and amount of the last patient payment and insurance payment will be reflected in these columns. The rest of the columns are basic contact information. Before we go over printing the statements for the patients, we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the report. The very last line is the totals for many of the columns on the report. We can see a total of how much is billable for all the patients of the practice, break that amount down by aging periods, and see how much we have charged in interest. To print the statements for your patients, we will start by clicking the Select All button. We can either view a preview of the statement by clicking on the preview icon, or we can begin printing. If you would like to send the statement via email for all the patients who have an email address on file, it is recommended that you select the entire list and click on the email icon. If a patient doesn't have an email on file, their statement will not be generated as an email. You will get a prompt that outlines how many patients were generated via email and how many were not. After the emails have all been generated, the patients who an email was generated for will no longer be selected. You can now print the remaining patients via printer. After printing, you will get the same prompt, letting you know how many statements were printed and how many were not, and why. After clicking OK, you will be asked if the statements printed correctly. If they did, click Yes. You will next be asked if you would like to forward the next statement date for the patients who had their statements printed. Click Yes to move them forward the number of days set in the billing setup, or No to leave it as the same date as before. The patients whose statements printed but the statement date was not forwarded will be highlighted in green, and those who the statement date was moved forward to the future will be in gray.